He ruled half the world, but couldn't spend a single night alone. Every evening at court ended the same way. The queen in tears, the king moaning, and a sound behind velvet curtains that palace guards would never forget. Because once the bedroom doors closed, no one left, not even her. This isn't the history they teach in school. There are no statues for what happened in that room, only whispers, only warnings of a man who screamed when the queen tried to leave his side, who couldn't sleep unless he was touching her, and who once made her stay in bed so long her skin began to rot. He was called His Most Catholic Majesty, but behind closed doors he was the most perverted king in Spain's history. How does a king end up like this? The answer is locked in a story of childhood trauma, grief, and an obsession so intense it turned his wife into a prisoner and the royal bed into a cage. To understand Philip's obsession, you have to go back long before the screams, long before the rot, to a boy who was never meant to wear a crown. They called him the Silent Bourbon. Born into the French royal family in 1683, Philip was quiet, withdrawn, and even as a child, he avoided touch, eye contact, and emotion. He would stare at the wall for hours, unmoving, and sometimes servants had to physically shake him to make sure he was alive. His tutors wrote that he seemed absent from the world. He rarely spoke, never smiled, and he didn't seem to care about anything except for one person, his mother, Maria Anna of Bavaria. She was the only one who could reach him, the only person he clung to. And when she died suddenly of tuberculosis, Philip didn't cry. He simply stopped talking altogether. Some historians now believe he had early signs of mental illness, while others think it was unresolved childhood trauma. Whatever it was, it followed him into adulthood, because when his older relatives died unexpectedly, the quiet boy from Versailles was suddenly thrust into power. At just 17 years old, he was crowned King of Spain. He didn't speak the language. He had no military experience. He barely showed emotion during the coronation. But when he looked at the Spanish court, foreign, cold, unfamiliar, he turned to the one thing that had once made him feel safe: a woman. They married in 1701. He was 17. She was 13. Maria Louisa of Savoy was chosen for political reasons, like most queens. But to Philip, she became everything. At first it seemed innocent, even sweet. He sat beside her at meals, escorted her everywhere, and listened to her voice like it was scripture. But soon it became something darker. He began refusing to eat unless she fed him. He wouldn't meet with ministers unless she sat beside him. And he couldn't sleep unless her body was touching his. One advisor said, "The queen is no longer a consort. She is a shadow, a nurse, a prisoner." Because Philip didn't just want her company, he required it constantly. In sickness, in health, in sleep, in prayer, in silence. When she needed space, he panicked. When she cried, he trembled. And if she ever tried to leave the room, he would scream. Not like a man, but like a child, panicked, an unhinged animal. At first, the palace covered for him. They said the king was sensitive, passionate. But it became harder to ignore when he stopped ruling altogether. Ministers stood outside his bedroom door for hours, waiting for royal decisions that never came. Because the king was in bed, stroking the queen's hair, murmuring nonsense, refusing to let her move. The servants called it the hour of dread. Every night around 2 in the morning, they would hear him screaming, moaning, whimpering. Not the sounds of a man in pain, but something worse: obsession. From behind the thick velvet drapes of the royal bedchamber, they could hear the queen sobbing, sometimes praying, sometimes begging, and still he would not let her go. The guards on duty would glance at each other, pale-faced, but they never intervened. To interrupt King Philip V of Spain in his pleasure was to risk execution. What happened behind those doors was never recorded in official history. No textbook tells you. No royal biographer dares mention it. But the truth was whispered in hallways, carved into servant journals, and preserved in the trembling voices of courtiers who outlived him. They said he couldn't sleep without touching her, that he refused to leave the bed for days, sometimes weeks, and that the queen, barely 20 years old, was not allowed to move without his permission. When she tried to escape the bed for even a moment, he would scream. Not just shout, but scream like a man being murdered. And so she stayed, through illness, through blood, through rot, through absolute humiliation, because if she didn't, he might lose his mind. By her early 20s, Maria Louisa was deteriorating. She had lost weight and rarely smiled. Her voice, once bright and musical, became strained, like she was speaking through exhaustion. But she wasn't sick with fever or plague. She was sick from being loved. Ministers begged him to return to his duties. He refused. He said, "What good is Spain without her?" Court life fell apart. All decisions passed through the Queen. War strategies, tax reforms, ambassador requests. She handled it all from the side of a royal bed, soaked in sweat and perfume. Some began calling her the Phantom Queen because no one saw her anymore. Only her voice, her orders, her written commands signed with a hand that trembled from exhaustion. In 1714, her body finally gave up. After a brief illness made worse by years of emotional captivity, Maria Luisa died at 25 years old. And when she passed, Philip shattered, not metaphorically. Physically, he collapsed beside her body and refused to move. For 3 weeks, he didn't eat or bathe. He simply lay there next to her cold body, waiting to die. Spain had no ruler, just a bedroom, a corpse, and a king who had no reason to live. They said the king was broken. He spoke in whispers, walked like an old man, and refused sunlight and food. But what terrified the court was how long it lasted. Months. When advisors finally begged him to remarry, to stabilize the monarchy, he laughed hysterically. Then he said something that chilled the room. "She is not dead. You don't understand. She is only hiding." He commanded his agents to find a woman who looked exactly like Maria Luisa. And they did. Her name was Elizabeth Farnese. In December 1714, just months after Maria's death, Philip married her. Not out of love, but out of obsession. He dressed her in his first wife's gowns, ordered her to sleep in the same bed, wear the same perfume, and speak the same phrases. The courtiers whispered, "He hasn't remarried. He's replaced her." At first, Elizabeth tolerated it, but then the expectations became commands. She was expected to stay in bed with him, not just at night, but during the day, for hours, sometimes days. A servant wrote, "The Queen does not live as a woman. She lives as a mirror." Philip was slipping further into madness. He would wake screaming from nightmares of Maria Luisa rotting in her tomb. He stopped wearing royal clothes, started dressing like a monk, and refused to cut his fingernails. By now it was impossible to contain the truth. Spain wasn't being ruled. It was being haunted. The court had a king in name, but what they really had was a man possessed by his dead wife. By 1724, Philip's behavior could no longer be spun, and he abdicated the throne to his son, Louis the Save. For a brief moment, the court breathed again. But the peace didn't last, because just 7 months into his reign, Louis fell violently ill with smallpox and died at 17. Instead of mourning, Philip smiled and said, "God has returned the crown to its rightful head." And just like that, he took the throne back, a king reborn, but not restored. He was paranoid, cruel, frightened by mirrors, and convinced that demons whispered to him through the fireplace. By the 1730s, Philip V of Spain no longer resembled a king. He rarely dressed, refused shoes, and wore only sackcloth robes. He slept in filth, refused to cut his hair, and refused to be seen in daylight. He believed shadows whispered secrets and that mirrors could trap souls. He no longer spoke in complete sentences, instead babbling and repeating the same prayers for hours. Sometimes he would scream and claw at the walls, cursing invisible demons. Other times he'd weep quietly, rocking in bed, begging for Maria Luisa to return. Ambassadors wrote that Spain had become a nation ruled by a ghost. And still, Elizabeth stayed, holding his trembling hands and speaking to him in the voice of the first queen, the only voice he truly heard. On July 9th, 1746, Philip V died. He died tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, clawing at the air, muttering Maria Luisa's name. There was no great funeral, just silence and the whispered relief of a nation that had waited 40 years to breathe again. History remembers Philip V as a king, but behind the crown was something else. A man undone by grief, a lover who became a jailer, a monarch who ruled not with power, but with obsession. This wasn't politics, this was possession. And the scars he left on Spain weren't carved in stone. They were carved in whispers, in silence, in locked doors, scented candles, and servants who pretended not to hear the screams. If this is the kind of royal history you were never taught in school, subscribe to our channel for more stories the textbooks tried to bury. And tell me in the comments, What other forgotten rulers deserve to be unearthed?